Hello, everyone. We'll just wait a moment while everyone logs in, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the third installment of California Wine Institute's Inside California Winemaking. Thank you all for taking the time out to be with us today. In this webinar series, produced specifically for our key Asian markets, wine writer and educator Elaine Chukan Brown speaks with top California producers, bringing a bit of the vineyards and the cellars of the Golden State to our international audience. We've scheduled these webinars to best suit your time zones in the hopes that this hour in the day suits your schedules, and the guest vintners featured in this series have also been selected with you, our audience, in mind, to bring you insights about wineries and wines that are present in your markets. Today we have the privilege to welcome Chantal Forthun of Flowers Vineyards Winery. So before we get started, some housekeeping reminders for everyone. During the webinar, know that there are two communication methods available to participants that we encourage you to use, a chat section as well as a Q&A section. So these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. So just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then there's the Q&A section, and that is where we would like you to submit your questions for Elaine and Chantal to answer toward the end of the webinar. We will do our best to address your questions, but please know that any that are not answered live will be provided in the Q&A summary in the email you'll receive following the program. Now I'd like to introduce our host, Elaine. In addition to writing for her own site, Waka Waka Wine Reviews, she serves as the American specialist for JancysRobinson.com and contributes to a long list of respected publications. She contributed to the 8th edition of the World Atlas of Wine, which has won multiple awards very recently, as well as the award-winning 4th edition of the Oxford Companion to Wine. She was named by the International Wine and Spirits Competition and Vinitaly as one of the top 5 wine communicators of the year in the world in the last 2 years in a row. And Chantal's extensive winemaking experience includes working with producers like Bonny Doon Vineyard, producing intentional terroir-driven wines using natural winemaking and sustainable farming, and working with biodynamic farming at Quartz Reef in New Zealand and Rhys Vineyard in Santa Cruz Mountains. Chantal's understanding that the Sonoma Coast possessed qualities unlike any other growing region in the world led her to jump at the opportunity to lead the winemaking team at Flowers in 2012. Now, Elaine, I'll turn it over to you.
Katie, thank you so much. Chantal, it's so good to have you.
Thank you, Elaine. It's so great to be here.
I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about your work at Flowers. Such a beautiful part of the world that we'll talk about, and really beautiful wines.
Thank you. I'm excited.
Thank you. And I really want to thank everyone that's here with us today. It is such an honor to be able to deliver this series specifically for markets across Asia. Some of my very favorite trips doing work in wine have been in many of your markets, and it's really quite a pleasure to be welcomed into your home. So thank you for being with us today. So I would love for us to just go ahead and start right away, making sure people understand the part of California that we're looking at, because it really is such a unique area, as Katie mentioned in your introduction, and such distinctive wines. So Katie, could we go ahead and pull up the maps? So we see here a nice overview of California, and you can see there a highlighted area, the box, that is specifying the part of California that we're going to zoom in on. Importantly, though, you'll notice it's above San Francisco and above San Francisco Bay in the broader region called the North Coast. But we're going to zoom in now to look at the part of California within that box, and this is featuring mainly Sonoma County. You can see there the outline in yellow is Sonoma County in general. You'll notice that it goes right up to the Pacific Ocean, and then you'll also see that within it, highlighted in pink, is the very large Sonoma Coast AVA. And we're going to focus our conversation today mainly on the Sonoma Coast AVA and different subzones or neighborhoods that fall within the Sonoma Coast AVA. But importantly, Katie can highlight two vineyards that we want to especially talk about today in the smaller Fort Ross Seaview AVA, which falls entirely inside of Sonoma Coast, in the mountains right there against the Pacific Ocean. And so, Chantal, could you go ahead and tell us about the two Flowers Vineyards that we're going to look at in a minute?
Sure. So in the late 80s, Joan and Walt Flowers helped pioneer this region that we now call Fort Ross Seaview. And so it's very important to understand how close it is to the ocean, but then also how mountainous and remote this region is. Mm-hmm. Your neighbors are miles, kilometers away. There's peaks and valleys. Then most of the vineyards are planted right on the mountain tops. And so this is really high elevation farming. At Flowers, we focus on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. And Joan and Walt Flowers really put a stake in the ground, along with David Hirsch and a couple others out there in the very late 80s and early 90s. And I think Walter, he came from agriculture. He was very meticulous, very detail-oriented. This is something that everybody knew about him, as well as his love for Pinot Noir. And so when he retired from his nursery job in agriculture on the East Coast, he wanted to plant a vineyard, which to me sounds just like so much work. Yeah. But he with that, he brought all of his meticulous attention to detail to plant these vineyards overlooking the Pacific Ocean and really in some of the most interesting soils within the Sonoma Coast region. So,
well, and let's go ahead and look at some photos of the vineyards, because it's really impressive how close to the ocean they are and how dramatic the scenery is. And that attention to detail, I think, is so necessary. So this is Camp Meeting Ridge, and you can, with the first vineyard that Flowers planted, and you can literally see the ocean there on the horizon. That bright area is the ocean lit up by the sun.
Yep. And these are the first vines that went into the ground in 1991. And then later there was a winery that was also built on this property. But so we own 425 acres of property on this ridgetop that you're looking at. But really only 29 of that is plantable. And so there's not a lot of area because of these really kind of steep slopes. And so that's why everything is planted on that ridge.
Well, and you'll notice too, all of the ridge tops are covered and surrounded by forest. Mm-hmm. Most of the property that you own there is actually down the cliffside, essentially.
Right.
And the other thing to point out here is that this vineyard is actually planted on the very first ridge, right up against the ocean. And so the photo here shows a kind of another knoll of the ridge that's part of where Flowers is planted, but this is considered the first ridge line against the ocean.
Right, so that makes for incredibly interesting growing conditions, really challenging land to farm, but also just, I think all of that kind of forest that surrounds this vineyard lends itself to, it's part of the terroir of these wines. So there's a lot of kind of savory components to the wines that we make at Flowers.
Well, and let's look at another photo of the same vineyard as well. So this is the same vineyard in the fall time, though. So you can see the leaves of the vines have changed. But again, notice the ocean is there on the horizon. It gives a little more view of how really varied the terrain is. And the yields through this area are incredibly low. It is very exposed to ocean weather. And again, this current that goes through this part of the Pacific Ocean along the Northern California coast is one of the coldest ocean currents in the world. And that means that it lowers temperatures through the area, creates cold maritime fog, and also colder ocean winds.
Mm-hmm.
That all really play into the style of the wines that you make.
Yeah, and I think what's really unique about Fort Ross Seaview AVA is most of all the vineyards are above that fog line. So we have the benefit of the sunshine throughout the growing season, but we also get all the benefits of the cooling wind coming off of the foggy Pacific.
Right. Some parts of the year too, those low spots kind of between the knolls of the ridge tops here can really fill with fog, and it can create sort of a cooling influence even if the vines are not covered by fog.
Absolutely.
But one of the other things though too, this whole area, the yields are low, the topsoils are very shallow, it is wind exposed, and all surrounded by forest. And I feel as though, for me, the Pinots from this area always have that kind of rocky, savory forest element to them, both in the nose and the flavor.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Well, let's go ahead. And so after this first site, Camp Meeting Ridge, was established, Flowers went on and planted Seaview. So let's go ahead and look at the first photo of that, which is, again, incredibly dramatic. Look at how varied the topography is. So beautiful. And notice, too, again, the ocean is right there.
Yeah, I think it's probably the only vineyard in the North Coast that you can stare straight down the Pacific Ocean and see Bodega Bay, and in some cases even Marin. So this property is incredibly interesting and has been my labor of love since I have joined Flowers. All of those, that dramatic topography and the dramatic exposure from the ocean, as you can imagine, it lends itself to all these really small microclimates within the vineyard. And so, we have kind of parceled out the vineyard by 1 or 2 acre blocks, and that goes back to how it was developed to begin with. But really, within each of those acres or 2 acres, there might be 4 different exposures because it's on a knoll. So it's been a really great discovery to kind of really dissect that over the last many years.
Well, and we have one more photo of Seaview Vineyard as well. And this is in the spring, but again, notice the direct exposure to the ocean. You can see again, this section of the vineyard is fully surrounded by forest as well, as we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think something else that's pretty interesting is there are the soil types here are really varied. And so there's kind of these almost 5 neighborhoods on this property that we have really yet to understand where those soils originated from. So we're bringing out a geologist actually in a few weeks to help us determine what the parent material is.
Well, and I love that too, because Flowers has been, they started doing this work in the late 80s. They start developing the first vineyard in the very beginning of the 90s. And Flowers has already proven the incredible quality of wines from the site. And still your team is focusing on, let's even understand it better. Let's fine tune even more, and actually bring in a geologist out to get to know it at that level.
Yeah, there's, it's really exciting, and it's absolutely something that continues to feed my curiosity and my spirit. This is absolutely why I love making wine.
That's great. That's great. Let's go ahead and start looking at the wines. We're going to start with Pinot, which the region is famous for. But let's go ahead and bring up that vineyard map again that shows the different areas. And so the first wine we'll look at today is Pinot Noir from Flowers from the Sonoma Coast AVA. But it's important to look at the map and see how incredibly large and varied Sonoma Coast AVA is. And so Flowers bottles beautiful single vineyard wines from the 2 sites we just looked at. But what we're going to talk about today is actually how working those 2 sites in concert with vineyards from other parts of the Sonoma Coast AVA, how that works together for you in blend, and also how to understand the different neighborhoods or subzones of Sonoma Coast. So could you talk through for us a little bit how, what are we seeing in this map, and what do you want to highlight between the different vineyards that we're looking at?
So when I think about the Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir, as we kind of talked about earlier, this is a super vast area that has a lot of vineyards planted. And many of these vineyards are planted kind of in alluvial valley floor areas. And so what I've really focused on is finding those sites that have true coastal expression, but then also the soils that provide textures that complement each other in order to create a wine that is truly coastal. And so, when we bottle those single vineyards from Fort Ross Seaview, there's a very strong character of those properties. We spoke about the tannin quality, kind of the rockiness, the floral and foresty. And as we kind of move south in this map, the Green Valley area is planted on more sand. And so that and it's quite cool. It's actually the second coolest growing region within the Sonoma Coast. And so you get a lot of hang time. You get really kind of brambly or darker red berry fruits and a little bit of plum. And then that kind of really kind of soft and tingly, almost like sandy texture to the wine, which ends up being very complementary to the rocky textures from Fort Ross.
And if I could jump in just for a second, one of the things I want to point out, Katie's done such a great job making this map for us from Google Maps. And so this is literally a satellite photo of the region. And what we're seeing here, if you notice the dark green areas, those are literally forests on the mountains. So you get a really nice image here in this map of the coastal mountains right there on the western side of Sonoma. And you'll notice that around where the marker for Green Valley is, the mountains start to wane a little bit. It gets a little lower. And then just below that, the forest ends. And that's because there's a break in the coastal mountain range there. And so the area that Katie's highlighting with her cursor right now is actually an opening in the mountain range that pulls in very, very cold maritime influence from the Pacific Ocean and floods Sonoma County with cold nighttime fog, but also very strong afternoon winds. And that's part of why Green Valley is such a cold area and has such a long extended growing season, as Chantal was describing.
Well, in addition, I think the Green Valley area, because there still is that coastal ridges and the coastal forest. So, when the fog does get into that part of the region, it takes a really long time to leave. And so it tends to be the very last place where the fog burns off at the end of each day.
Well, and that's really important too, because as you mentioned earlier, Fort Ross Seaview and the two vineyards that Flowers has there, they're high elevation above the fog line. So the light exposure is stronger there. But the Green Valley AVA, because it is lower elevation and the fog stays longer, that actually lessens the light exposure over the course of the day. Because if the fog is over the vines, that's acting like a diffusing filter, keeping the sunlight from hitting the leaf and fruit zone. And so really slowing down ripening, as you were saying.
Yeah. The wines from here, they're beautiful, and I always get this kind of if you think about like we have a lot of wild blackberries here in California, and so there's something about that vine, the way that vine smells in combination with that juicy blackberry fruit. That's kind of what these wines smell and taste like from this region.
Well, and there's always incredible acidity from Green Valley as well, really just this vibrant sense of freshness. But the sandy soils you mentioned are actually quite common in the lower elevation parts of western Sonoma County. And in my mind, they create what I think of as almost like a melting tannin. It's a tannin that's very present, but it's so fine-grained, it almost melts and spreads across the whole palate.
I love that word because that describes it perfectly. There's this wonderful experience of that high acidity and that melting tannin that just is a marker for this region.
Yes. And so now there's two other areas, though, that this wine also comes from, and that's Sebastopol Hills, and then a little bit further south where the Sonoma Coast AVA overlaps with Petaluma Gap AVA. So could you speak to the character those both bring as well?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, there is a break in that coastal forest, and that happens right before we get to the Sebastopol Hills neighborhood. And I like to think of the Sebastopol Hills as almost like an uplifted old ocean floor, because really here, you still have the sandy soils, but it's sandy in this almost fluffy, dusty way. Mm-hmm. So when you're walking these sites and you're putting your feet on the ground, there's these little poofs of sandy dust that come up. This is a very flat area, and it does benefit greatly from that cool coastal wind coming through the gap. For me, these tend to have a little bit more structure to them than the Green Valley. I don't necessarily, there's an attribute of that melting tannin that we were talking about, but they're a little bit more structural. And then the fruit is a little bit bluer, more like a blueberry, a hint of kind of, not quite cola, but maybe sarsaparilla, like an herbal quality to them. And I love what that does for kind of the mid palate of this. Mm-hmm.
Well, and I know we've actually through vineyard studies have found that areas like Sebastopol Hills, but even more so Petaluma Gap, that have that wind exposure, it creates slightly thicker skins and often also lower yields and sometimes slightly smaller berries. And so that can create a little more of that structure you're talking about and a little more concentration as well.
Exactly.
And so, and then the fifth site that we want to talk about, of course, is in the Petaluma Gap, but in an area that does overlap with the Sonoma Coast AVA. So could you tell us about that site as well?
So our site in the Petaluma Gap is very much on the western side of the Petaluma Gap. And so it has a lot of that wind exposure, that breeziness. And then the soils here have a little bit more clay. And so the texture of these wines are a little bit broader. They have almost this, they have a tightness that I attribute to the clay, but it's not necessarily chalky like you would get from a rocky site. So there's a tightness, but it's also very kind of broad. And what I really love about the aromatics of the site here is that they are a little bit more rustic. They're a little bit more earthy rather than fruity. And so we get a lot of like this cedar, lilac, and it's more kind of a dried, but not dried out. It's almost like black tea, a lot of black tea and dried foresty. I
think of those soils with a little more clay as they almost give like oomph or power to a wine. So there's just a little more muscle is how I think about it.
And to me, it is what is the core. And not by volume at all, but that core, it's what's knitting all of these 5 sites together to make one wine. It's kind of the seam that's tying things together.
Well, and tasting the wine, it's really actually quite remarkable to, I feel as though I really get all of these components. They come together as a real constellation of elements or a harmony of different tones in the wine. And I think of Fort Ross Seaview as being really aromatic. Again, that little bit of rockiness, but very aromatic, kind of a northern forest, a cool northern forest. Right. But then as you're saying, the Petaluma Gap brings more of that almost drier, resinous forest element. And then there's the little bit of flowers, a little bit of spice, really nice acidity, and a really lovely combination of kind of giving flavor across the whole palate, but really a very clear sense of direction and spine to the wine as well. It's just such a lovely blend. Could you comment just briefly before we start talking about Chardonnay, how do you approach thinking about the blend working with these different sites? How do you approach trying to bring them together?
So one of the things that's pretty remarkable for this blend is we have been in partnership with all the 3 sites that are not our estates. We have been in partnership with them for almost 20 years. And so there is a lot of kind of institutional knowledge about the properties, but also this kind of relationship that I have with the people who grow these grapes. And so the Petaluma Gap site, like I said, really kind of provides that core. And when I think about the guy who farms this, he's this big guy and he's muscly and he's definitely like the power. He's like, even in his character, it's funny. And then as you move into kind of the Sebastopol Hill and the Green Valley, that's really kind of all of this fleshy mid palate. That's what's kind of, you know, helping that lead the direction of the focus through the palate. And then as you get into the coastal ridges, that's kind of, I think, what's really bringing that tannin expression all together, and also those beautiful lifted floral aromas from those sites. And so I feel now that I have figured out the right amount from each vineyard to achieve this wine. And it's a pretty equal representation from those sites. They really bring together like what the true coast is.
Can you comment to one of the questions that's come in is about how we said that Green Valley, for example, has a much longer or extended growing season. Can you comment how different is the timing for harvest on each of these sites that we mentioned?
So the coastal sites are absolutely, we start picking there first, but we also pick there last.
Wow.
We attribute that really to that Seaview dynamic where there's so many different exposures. And so we have, you know, stuff that's on rock that's a little bit more exposed to the wind and the sun that definitely comes in, you know, it's the end of August. And then the last blocks from there will come off 6 weeks later. And then everything else kind of fits in between. So the Pinot Noir harvest on that true coast is really only maximum 6 weeks from beginning to end. But if I had to kind of order them, it would be the true coast and then the Petaluma Gap and then Green Valley and then Sebastopol Hills.
Right. So just to clarify for people watching, when you say the true coast, you mean the 2 sites there in Fort Ross Seaview area, so Camp Meeting Ridge and Seaview. And I want to restate what you just said because it's really remarkable. In that one little area where Camp Meeting Ridge and Seaview Vineyard are located, it's actually a 6-week span for how differently the vines ripen.
Yeah.
Which really, I think, illustrates quite powerfully how varied the topography and like you said, the different aspects and the different microclimates in the site. That's really quite remarkable.
Yeah. And 6 weeks would be kind of best case scenario of vintage, that there was pretty moderate weather and plenty of hang time during that kind of harvest season. We've done everything in 4 weeks before. So
that's amazing. Yeah. So let's go ahead and talk about just a little bit. If you could just highlight kind of the key steps you take for winemaking here. I know something people often want to find out about is, does whole cluster work in these areas and your views on that, but also how long are you aging these wines before they're released? So
all of the wines at Flowers are made with native fermentation. I have been doing this for almost 10 years at this point. It is important to me because we are farming these sites organically and also holistically with incorporating some biodynamic preparations, that we honor that same spirit and philosophy in the winery as well. And we do that by minimal intervention winemaking and native yeast, using our native yeast. So everything is hand sorted. Fermentations are pretty quick. We keep everything separate. So each one of those vineyard sites, each block at each of those vineyard sites will be fermented in its own tank. and it will be kept separate throughout the entire winemaking process so that we are able to evaluate each block year on year to see how we can improve upon. We're really limited, we don't use a lot of new oak at all. These blends that we're tasting today are about 18% new oak. And we are aging these wines for about the Pinot Noir is 10 months in barrel prior to bottling.
Right. Which is also a nice way to really capture the freshness that we've been talking about too. Really gets it in the bottle. So let's go ahead and look at the Chardonnay.
Yeah.
Another wine that I really just love and enjoy. And it's actually, these coastal areas, I think it's easy for us to think of Chardonnay in relation to Sonoma, but actually there's not a lot of Chardonnay, especially in the mountains. And so for Flowers to be growing it there at Seaview Vineyard, it's really quite significant. Could you speak to that a little bit as well?
So the Chardonnay is planted at Camp Meeting Ridge.
Oh, excuse me, I reversed them.
Okay, it happens all the time. But it's what's really fascinating is, when Jonah and Walt planted this vineyard almost 30 years ago, there wasn't a whole lot of Chardonnay in this mountain region. They were, I believe, they were the second people to plant Chardonnay, and someday I'm going to ask him why, because I really think that this region creates very, very special Chardonnay. The Chardonnay grown at Camp Meeting Ridge has a very distinct coastal saltiness or brightness to it, while at the same time having a lot of kind of almost a rich mouthfeel that also has very high acidity. And so I attribute all of that to that kind of high elevation close to the Pacific.
I love the Chardonnay from that area because it's so palate stimulating. You get that. It's a hard combination to find, but this perfect harmony of flavor, palate presence, but then with really bright through lines of acidity, and then that briny character that you're talking about. I feel like it makes the mouth water almost more than the acidity does.
I know.
And really goes so beautifully with food.
It goes so beautifully with food, and these Chardonnays are aging just incredibly. These wines from kind of, when the vines got to be about 10 years old. So all of the Chardonnays from the early and mid 2000s are just singing right now. And I think that that's absolutely something that we don't talk about aging Chardonnay in California ever. So
their Chardonnay really can age incredibly well. And so I just want to restate, the Chardonnays from Flowers, 15 or 20 years, you can continue to drink them, which is really quite remarkable. We should be fair though. And would you comment briefly on how the Pinot from the region ages too?
The Pinot ages very well also. There's a little bit more volatility in the vintage. And so I think that the Pinot Noir, especially in its youth, in those kind of same vintages, the warmer ones you can see that in the wine as it's aging, and they're not aging as well. The really cold ones have held up incredibly well. Luckily, especially recently, we've been really blessed with some pretty nice vintages. So I'm excited to see how, as these wines continue to age, how the ageability of the wines increases, I'm assuming.
So one of the questions that's coming in, and something that we really like to talk about too, but I admit I'm springing it on you. I didn't actually ask you to address this, but foods that you love to pair with these wines. I actually feel that both of these wines have a kind of freshness and a very light use of oak in a way that makes them work well even for a mix of sushi or sashimi. And I think the Pinot, for myself, just a tiny bit of grill flavor works well with the Flowers Pinot, or baked salmon also works very well. Do you have other thoughts on favorite foods for these two wines?
I think all of those suggestions sound amazing. I think what I love is that these wines are incredibly versatile. And so you can pair the Pinot Noir with something that you might typically pair, a Chardonnay with, and vice versa. So yeah, all of those suggestions sound great. I tend, especially now that we're coming into having, fresh produce from our gardens because we're in summer, vegetables, grill a little bit of grilled vegetable or even fresh vegetables, because of that kind of savory herbal quality in these wines. It just goes really well.
Well, especially that kind of coastal briny character in the Chardonnay, I just think makes it really very versatile. And it avoids too much richness. You still have that real ample presence of flavor, but there's no heaviness, which means it really can hold up to vegetables too. So one of the questions that's coming in is just thinking about these coastal regions. We've been talking about fog, we've been talking about ocean winds, but of course, there's a lot of rain that can be in the Sonoma Coastal Mountains. Something people don't often know is that the coastal mountains of Sonoma are actually one of the wettest, rainiest parts of California. And so could you speak a little bit to the kinds of farming choices that need to come up in order to address these different weather characteristics, on a dry year versus a wet year, but also we're being asked to address how is farming changed as we consider things like global warming and weather changes that come with that too.
I'm going to address them backwards, I think.
Okay.
Easier. What's amazing, I do not think anybody who's farming anything can deny that climate change is happening. The vines in their youth in Camp Meeting Ridge and Seaview Ridge, we used to pick these grapes in the end of October into November and that was in their youth. So typically younger vines tend to ripen a little bit faster. And so the growing season has really shortened in the last 30 years. And in order, I look at, having 30 years of a Chardonnay and Pinot Noir vineyard in these mountain ranges and even in the Sonoma Coast. It's an old vineyard. And so we have drastically changed our approach in the vineyard, understanding that it is our job to continue to steward these vines into their elderlyhood. I don't want to pull the vines out ever. So we've changed our pruning techniques so that we are, all of these vines are cane pruned, and that means that we're cutting away a lot of wood every year. And so we are consciously making smaller cuts, as small as possible, in order to continue to build wood structure on these vines in order to make sure that we're maximizing sap flow. About 10 years ago, we converted from conventional to organic farming, something that is really important to me, but also I think in keeping these vines alive and letting them age properly. And then we've also started to incorporate the biodynamic preparations as well. I think I missed a part of the question.
Well, so in relation to the climate change question, something that is being further asked, you mentioned that you, of course, are picking earlier in the year. But I want to point out part of what that means is that the arc of light over the course of the day is different earlier in the year.
Right.
But the temperatures at harvest are also different earlier in the year. So the question that we're being asked is, has this changed how you need to farm or how you need to prepare for harvest?
We are doing things in the vineyard to kind of slow the ripening process. There are, with the low yields out on the coast and the kind of shortening of the season, we have seen, especially in the warmer seasons, that the grapes from a sugar standpoint are kind of racing to the finish line. And physiologically, they might not be in line with the amount of sugar that's in the grapes. So you have high sugars, but you don't necessarily have, you still have a lot of acid. You might have really green seeds. So
Right.
everything's isn't in balance. And so the pruning that we are implementing, but then also we are kind of really making sure that we're maximizing the amount of canopy that is present. We are trying not to hedge. We are limiting our leafing, both to kind of protect and allow for the shading of the fruit, but also to kind of maximize the photosynthesis that can happen throughout the season. And then even this year, we're actually going to trial a little bit of shade cloth on our most exposed vineyards.
Oh, interesting.
Just to kind of slow everything down. And then, of course, you know, I really think that this heavy dose of vermicompost and seaweeds and micronutrients into the soils are very supportive, kind of in addition to all of the investments that we're already making in our fertility with compost and cover crops. So it's very much we're addressing it in the soil and the canopy the most.
Right. So I just want to restate a couple of the things you just said. So one of the challenges of things coming in earlier because of global warming is that sometimes the sugar ripeness comes in ahead of the tannin development and the acid respiration. And so acid in the fruit decreases over time over the course of ripening, and the tannin essentially softens and gets less green over the course of ripening. But when the weather is more extreme, it can be hard to get those three things to kind of line up in perfect harmony, and then add into that the fourth piece, which is flavor development. And the challenge of getting all these things to come in together can be quite hard. But if we think of each leaf as a little battery pack for ripening the fruit, then the more leaves you have with clear exposure to the sun, the easier it will be to ripen the fruit in time. But I think it's really important to point out too that you emphasized that part of how you're approaching organic farming with some biodynamic components is very much on soil health, because that makes it easier for the vines to adjust to these changing weather conditions as well.
It's a very good summary.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, one of the things that everyone loves to talk about with Pinot, but I know that we were actually more interested in talking about with Chardonnay, is just clonal selection. Now, California, of course, has a mix of clonal material, both what we would call heritage clones, essentially vine cuttings that have developed over time here within the state of California, but also Dijon clones, which were developed in a nursery in France and then brought over. And so could you just briefly comment onto the role of these for Pinot? And then I know you feel it's especially important in Chardonnay. So could you speak a little bit more to that?
So we work with a mix of clones for Pinot Noir for the Sonoma Coast and our estate properties. I'm a really big fan of the Calera clone for the structure and the concentration. I love the Swan clone for kind of these really perfumey aromatics. And then I absolutely think that there is an important role that the Dijon clones play, particularly the 828 for the kind of florality that it tends towards, as well as the 777 for a little bit more of like a broadness or a mouthfeel component. And then the 115 can have a very kind of present tannin depending on the site that it's planted in. So those are a few of my favorites.
Right. So just to clarify too, for people watching, the first clones that were mentioned through names like Calera and Swan, we would call those heritage clones here in California. They're actually clonal selections of Pinot that developed over time in the original Joseph Swan vineyard and in the original Calera vineyards, but now have been planted over much of the state. But then what we would call the number clones, those are Dijon clone references. So now though with Chardonnay, I know you feel that clonal selection is especially important. So could you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. The clone that was planted at Camp Meeting Ridge in the early 90s was the old Wente clone, or sometimes referred to as shot Wente, we call it Hyde Old Wente because we got it from Larry Hyde.
Right.
But this cluster is no bigger than my fist. And then it's quite a loose cluster with really small berries, a combination of really small berries and larger berries. And so what that does is it allows kind of this variability of ripening within that cluster. I find it is very challenging to make a single expression of Chardonnay from a single site with a single clone, because it's be very simple and one-dimensional. This Shot Wente is the exception because you're creating some of that diversity because of the cluster morphology. So you get really great acidity, you also get concentration and texture, and then this really wonderful flavor. And it is also incredibly transparent to sight, which is why it's my favorite one for kind of the Sonoma Coast region.
No, that makes sense. Some of the, again, Chardonnay clones are not talked about quite as much as Pinot clones, but I know some of them are unbelievably perfumed and aromatic and in a way hide site character a little bit because the perfume is so strong. And then others could be more savory or like broader across the palate. And Wente is really one of California's great contributions to the world of wine, I'd say. You know, it's really one of the great historical aspects of California Chardonnay, but has also been brought into many other regions in the world and really helped establish Chardonnay in those as well. But I think, again, because with that one type of vine material, you can get so much complexity, as you were saying. So we have a couple of questions that I'd like to make sure we get to, but we are, before we sign off, we're almost out of time. So one of the things that we're being asked about is, do you have favorite vintages? In asking that question, if you could say a little bit about why those vintages, and from an outside perspective, I might say perhaps, for example, longer, cooler vintages are a favorite, or perhaps more even vintages. Can you comment on how vintage and their character plays in for you as a winemaker?
I mean, it's everything. You know, you want to control so much, and you are at the mercy of Mother Nature. And so really it is her gift to, the vintage is her gift. And that's what makes it so interesting. I tend to find positive merits in all the vintages that I've worked. I do especially enjoy the cooler ones. 2011 and 2015, at least out on the coast, come to mind. 11 was very cool, a lot of rain, and produced wines that are incredibly elegant and had, out of the gate, I think they were pretty simple and people weren't that crazy about them, just 11 in general. And as it's aged in bottle over the last 8 years, they're beautiful.
I think actually 2011 is one of California's great Chardonnay vintages. It was such a hard year for something like Cabernet, but I honestly think people should definitely look for 2011 on Chardonnay. It's such a special vintage for that.
Yeah.
2015,
because the crop was so low, and it was a weird thing that happened because we had incredibly bad weather during flowering, and so these clusters were really variable. The crops were down at least 50%, and you could see on clusters that you had green berries and pink berries and ripe berries and raisins all on the same cluster, and then you would have a completely normally ripe cluster next to it. And so I opted to kind of allow these clusters to hang for the maximum amount of time, and I think it was the right decision because we kind of have been able to omit any of those greener flavors, but it brought so much concentration to these wines. And then the acidity was still there. So that's another one for the ages. 16, 17, and 18. 16 and 18 especially, they're quite similar. And I think I would describe, as well as 19, kind of your classic Sonoma Coast vintage, which is, you know, pretty perfect California weather.
Yes. Yeah.
Throughout the course of it. And then when it comes, you know, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are often marked by weather events that happen during harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And in 16, 18, and 19, there were no weather events. We had a nice fog bank sitting out on the coast. It kept everything cool. Everything was moderate. There was no kind of logistical challenges to get the grapes off the vine. We didn't have to mobilize. It was just very evenly paced. And certainly those are fun.
Yeah. So one of the other questions that's coming up, you mentioned earlier, you know, there's a focus on using ambient yeast or natural yeast. In other words, not inoculating with commercial yeast. But you have moved the winery more recently. And so could you comment on any changes you've seen there or choices that you made in order to kind of anticipate the move?
Well, yes, I can talk about this.
Yes.
One of my favorite topics. We began studying the genetic material of our yeast about 5 years ago. And so we're working with the local lab to kind of identify the different strains that we have in our house. We have been able to show that our yeast population is repeatable year on year. It doesn't have any relationship to any commercial yeast on the market. And we can actually track it. There are representative markers of yeast from each of the vineyards that we talked about earlier.
Which is amazing, yeah.
Take that yeast from the Petaluma Gap, sample it before it even gets to the winery. I just take it directly to the lab, and then that yeast that's present on those grapes will be present in juice before kind of the Saccharomyces takes over. But even in the end of fermentation, there's a small percentage of that yeast still present. And this is something that I think they've tried to prove purposefully in studies with the lab, and they haven't been able to do that. So it's quite a fascinating project.
Well, so scientifically, though, it's really just the last 5 years that we've been able to isolate yeast so specifically. And so it's really, we're on, like, it's a new frontier in terms of our understanding these kinds of connections and the role that inoculated yeast or not inoculated yeast can play and the different sites like you were talking about. It's really quite exciting. And so it's very special that Flowers is choosing to follow this and help contribute to our understanding as a wine community around the world in that way.
Yeah, it's really exciting. As far as moving the winery, I knew that we were moving the winery. And so I began to isolate the yeast actually on slides with the lab. And so they provided the slides before we moved the winery. We created this big culture in the springtime. And we created a culture in the springtime and put it in a backpack sprayer. And then my team and I walked around the cellar and just spread this yeast throughout the cellar, on the barrels, over the tanks, in the catwalk, so that we were trying to mimic how that yeast would exist in our cellar naturally over time. And my hope was that we would outcompete any of the yeast that were here prior to us getting here. And we have been successful in doing that. And now it will be very curious to watch it age at this new location. It will certainly evolve year after year. And so I'm excited to see how that goes.
Yeah, it really is quite exciting. That as a world of wine, we're able to investigate these kinds of things. But again, for a winery to choose to be part of that sort of research it's really significant. So thank you.
Yeah.
So we're almost out of time. I know though that Flowers has been doing some virtual wine events as well, and we're being asked about those. So could you just briefly comment on what those are and how someone can participate?
I think the best way to track what we're doing virtually is to follow along on our website or Instagram if possible. Mm-hmm. I've been doing some Instagram lives recently. Also, if you would like to do a tasting with our team at Flowers, we're also offering virtual tastings with our hosts right here in the tasting room.
Yes, which is great. So it's possible to contact the winery and arrange a tasting in that way. So what I want to clarify, we are out of time, but because both the cuvées that we talked about today are from a blend of sites, my understanding is they're also a blend of different clonal types. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that was something that got asked as well. And so, but Flowers does also do single vineyard bottlings of both Pinot and Chardonnay, of course, and I do recommend those. They're really beautiful wines. I do want to especially say, Chantal, that one of the things that's been wonderful to witness in keeping up with Flowers now for quite a long time, there's a sense of, the wines have always, of course, been significant and really beautiful and quite unique because they are from this coastal region, which is such a dramatic place. But I have to say that under your stewardship, there's a sort of increase in elegance, an increase in finesse, a really more fine-tuned sense of harmony, and also that kind of transparency to place. And I so appreciate that. And so I just wanted to take a moment to let you know.
That's such an amazing compliment. Thank you very much.
I'm really grateful too for the time that you have given in helping me to spend time in the region. As you said, it's very remote. It's actually quite hard to get to. The vineyards that we looked at photos of earlier, it takes a long time to get to them just because you have to go through the mountains. And so to be able to visit the region with you has been very special. So thank you for that. And thank you for making time with us today. And thank you again to everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Chantal. Thank you to our attendees. Thank you for joining us today. As a reminder, we will have a video recording of the webinar available to you in the next few days, and we hope you will join us in 2 weeks for the next episode of Inside California Winemaking, featuring Greg Brewer of Brewer Clifton in the Santa Rita Hills of Santa Barbara County. The webinar will take place on Thursday, July 9th. So thank you again.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.